Dr. Leung is an epidemiologist and naturopathic doctor. She's an assistant professor and Emmy Drook Chair in Complementary and Alternative Health Care in the Faculty of Health Sciences. Her research has examined the role of prenatal nutrition on maternal mood and child development and the importance of pregnancy and birth cohort studies. She's currently the U of L facilitator for the Alberta Strategic Patient-Oriented Research Support Units, a very important initiative in the province, and a member of the Campus Alberta Steering Committee, and she's also on the board of directors of the Interdisciplinary Network for CAM, I gather it means Complementary and Alternative Medicine Research. So I'd like to present to you Dr. Leung.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out during lunchtime. I'm conscientious that it is the middle of the day, and so I will try to keep my talk within the hour so that your rumbling tummies can go and get a break and some food. So when Susan asked me to do a talk, my first reaction was, well, Susan, I don't really, my research is not really in global health or economics or demography. What should I really talk about? And Susan was really sweet. Well, people will want to hear about your research. You should talk about that. And of course, being an academic, I said, well, it's always good to have an opportunity to talk about research. But, I want to tell a story. I want to frame it around something that you are interested in. So being an academic, I need to find out, how I can fit in to the theme of the Institute. So I went and looked up demography, and I think all of you, or most of you, would know what that is. So the definition of it is the study of statistics. So I went, well, I'm an epidemiologist, check. I can talk about stats, biostats of different events. And so the events, in my case, is usually related to disease, the incidence of disease. I thought, okay, another check, excellent. I can do this now. And then finding the changing structure, impacting human populations. Well, one of the most, I think, drastic changing structures within our society these days is what we eat. A lot of us don't think about that, but it really is. And so another check. And so I thought, okay, I guess I'm good to go. And so for today, this is what I will talk about. From the stats perspective, the prevalence of mental disorders, focusing on depression, maternal depression. That's the area of my research. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about the changing structure of a diet in our modern society, from the paleo time to our digital society, how that has changed, how drastic it has changed. And then I will talk briefly, hopefully briefly, about some of the projects that I am currently working on. So, why diet? Besides the love of food, I love food, consider myself a foodie, but that's not the main reason why I choose that as a topic of research. This quote from Munch, it's been about a dozen years since its publication, I think provides that essence of why diet, food, nutrition is important and an area that we need to pay a lot of attention to. And he says that it's our continuous exposure to foods throughout our lifetime that renders diet the most important environmental factor, challenging our biological system. And one of the most important biological systems that we don't seem to, or I think we're paying more attention to it now, but for the longest time that we kind of somewhat ignore, is our brain, our nervous system, right? And the connection to what we put into our bodies. And so why the brain? Well, my background, my undergrad is actually in biopsychology. So from way back, I've always been fascinated by the brain, by how it works. And from my courses in anatomy, physiology, I feel I have a good understanding of, say, how the heart works, how the kidneys work, how the lungs work. But when it comes to the brain, there's so much we don't know. We can dissect into it, we could look into the microscope, yet we still cannot really fully understand what is going on there. Because if we can understand that, we may not have a madman in the White House right now, right? So there's so much complexity to that one structure that controls so much. What's that? Oh, I think it's a bit more than that, unfortunately. And so, so the fascination with the brain is the other kind of area that I have put my focus on. And from what we do know, I guess some basic stats about the brain, it takes up about 2% of our body weight, not very much, right? It's lighter than a ball that you can bounce around. But it's a very active, busy, demanding organ. It takes up to 15% of our cardiac output, so there's a lot of blood going to our brain. It consumes 20% of the oxygen that we take in, so there's something going on there. And it uses up 25% of the fuel in our body. So that's a pretty busy little organ for what it is in weight. And it's very busy. It accounts for 20 to 25% of the resting metabolic activity. I mean, I think at rest, even our muscles don't work that much. So there's definitely something going on in that structure that we call the brain. And so this, the link, I guess, between nutrition and brain function, brain health, it's not new. If we look at cultures like in Chinese medicine, in Ayurvedic medicine, it's been recognized that what we put into our body affects how we feel physically, but how we also function mentally, emotionally. Even dating back to the time of the Greeks and the Romans, they recognized that intimacy, that connection there. Somehow along the way, as we got more technological, as we got more civilized in some ways, we've kind of lost that connection. We've lost that knowledge of how we are very much connected to the environment, connected to the foods that are out there, and connected to how we are and function. So, one of the things I would say, a child with ADHD is more likely to be suffering from magnesium deficiency than they are from having a Ritalin deficiency. But what is our usual line of treatment or approach in dealing with conditions like that? It's not about looking into what they're eating, right? What they're consuming. And there'll be some starting stories in terms of how our food group, how that has changed. And so now we are recognizing that, and there's more and more work that is being done looking at that link between what we eat, what we put into our bodies, and how that is affecting our neural circuit. Right? So let's see, your turn. What do you know about brain-food connection? What is the main fuel source in the brain? How many people say it's A? One person? How many? Two? Was that for A? Oh, B. Okay. How many say B? And how many say C? Not everybody answered. So what does that mean?
We don't know what is C.
The answer is B, so the majority got that. The main fuel, the only fuel that our brains use is glucose. So it doesn't matter if you have a high protein diet, a high fat diet, eventually it gets converted into glucose, and that's what your body needs, right? But think about what happens if you have a high sugary, refined diet. All that sugar going to your brain. I think a lot of us have felt the consequences of that, right? What about this one? What is the percentage of fat making up the dry weight of the brain? How many say A?
Another person.
B? C? So about a handful, half a dozen guesses? C? There's a very strong C there. The answer is actually A. We're a bunch of fatheads. That's one way to put it. No, really, I mean, fat is a very important nutrient, and fat is in every single cell in our body, right? The bilipid layer. And in our brain, it's comprises the majority of the dry weight. Neurotransmitters are made out of which of the following? A, fatty acids. Some nod. B, polysaccharides. C, amino acids. Yes, amino acids. Right. So we need the proteins in order to for neurotransmitter synthesis and function. And so even there, broadly speaking, you can see the importance of food in how our brains work. So let's just look at the stats part of it in terms of mental health, mental illness, and what's going on at the global level and at the more, I guess, local level in Canada and Alberta. So the stats are not encouraging for mental disorders. This is a report from the World Health Organization. I think it was pretty recent, 2012 or something. The overall prevalence of mental disorder, globally speaking, is about 17%. Okay, and that's for prevalence in the 12-month period, right? So over 1 year, that is the prevalence. The prevalence is much higher in a lifetime. So about a third, globally speaking, a third of people have experienced some form of mental disorder, mental illness in their lifetime, which is pretty phenomenal when you look at, the amount of money, energy that goes into research, work that is done in cancer, right? Because I can tell you there's not billions and billions of dollars being thrown into mental health or mental illness research. And the thing with mental illness even now is that there's just so much stigma associated with mental illness, and so the attention is still not there for a good number of reasons. There's a cultural aspect to it, social aspect to it, economic aspect to it. There's just so many factors that are associated with it. And depression is the most, I guess, common, the biggest burden of disease out of all the mental disorders. And globally speaking, it affects about over 4% of the global population. And the other disturbing thing is that it's not plateauing, it's not going down. If anything, it's going up. And I think you can see partly why that's going on. You can probably see that a lot of us probably have some experience in terms of families, friends, people we know, having that have happened. And so in that 20-year period, it went up almost 40%. Again, pretty phenomenal when you think about other chronic diseases, right? And so it's a problem because it's the fact that it affects our productivity, our livelihood, our quality of life. And so again, this is global stats. In terms of the disability adjusted life for years, that's the burden of disease in terms of years lost due to disability or death. It affects over 7%. Depression, again, being the most common disorder, affecting that about 40%, right? That's pretty high. And then anxiety and other conditions, disorders like addictions, also affects a fairly large population, percentage of the population. So in my area of research, I focus on children and kids, and again, it's also, the numbers are alarming. That's 4% of children with pervasive developmental disorder, and then behavioral disorder at over 3%. And the numbers are increasing as well. In Canada, we fare a little better, but not that much better. In terms of lifetime prevalence of depression is over 12%. And a little under 5% for past year experience. And then almost 2% for just the last 30 days, right? And there are a number of factors, obviously, affecting and characteristics associated with depression. It is more common in women than men. But what we see is that as we age, that gap narrows, so that with advancing age, the number of women and the number of men that are affected are more equal. And these numbers came from the Canadian Community Health Survey from 2012, so not too long ago. And then one of the areas of my research has to do with postpartum depression, and that the stats are somewhat variable, around 9%. And then depending on the literature you look at, it can go up to as high as 20%, depending on the population. And there are a number of factors as to why pregnant women, after they deliver, suffer from depression. Stress is part of it. Social support is a huge contributor to depression. And all the papers I've done, analysis I've done, social support always comes up as one of the major predictors of postpartum depression or even prenatal depression. So there's definitely a societal component to the condition. And then prior depression as well. So having the episode of depression before pregnancy. And I think one of the reasons why I kind of turn to postpartum depression is that when you think about illness, usually it affects the person. I break a leg, I can't work for a few weeks, I have a decreased quality of life, what have you. When it comes to mental illness, like depression, it doesn't affect just the individual, right? Especially in new moms, right? It affects the family, the kids for sure. And we do know that there's a fairly strong connection between depression and mom and how well a child fares. So they're much more likely to develop depression themselves or other forms of mental illness. They are much more likely to do poorly in school. They do poorly down the road in terms of economically, socially. So the consequence is not just about the one person using up services, having higher demand on the healthcare system. It goes beyond that, right? And so that is something that we really do need to consider as well. So those are the stats on the event in terms of mental illness and depression. And so what is it, this changing structure that I want to look at, this idea of diet and why? Who here thinks that our dietary practices have actually changed in the last 100 years? So I won't ask you in the last 10,000 years. Yeah, because that's a definite yes, right? What's that? Okay. Yeah, I'm coming to that. So, where did we come from? What have we been eating? Where are we now? Is an important part of the question. So, I mean, a lot of the historical, anthropological evidence comes from evolutionary biology, looking at where we came from, what we think we ate way back when. And so, prior to we humans, I guess, settling down and started farming, we roamed and we hunted and we gathered and such, and all of you know that story, right? We kind of romanticize it and think it's a great time. In some ways it is, and in some ways it isn't. Nutritionally speaking, it was a good time, because compared to what it is now, right, it's all relative. But in terms of all other creature comforts, there's no way you can text somebody to come and pick you up, right? So there's a lot of give and take. But So going back to before we settled down into our farming communities, our diet was very different from where it is 10,000 years ago, and definitely very different from today. Back then, those pictures are actually too pretty for, I think, the food they ate back then. It's not representative. But they did have a very high fiber diet. Okay, we're looking at the middle column here, which I'm sure you cannot see because I can't blow the picture up anymore. It's already pretty fuzzy. Interestingly enough, they had a much higher fat intake than compared to protein and carbs. Carbs is probably on the lower side of their overall intake. And we know from the evolutionary biology evidence that how we have changed, how we have evolved, is due largely to what was available to us through the food, right? Because we eat a diverse amount, but types of food. And so we were exposed to all sorts of nutrients, right? And so we know that with the increase in diet quality, our brains were able to increase in size and complexity, right? So our brains got more convoluted, there were more sulci and gyri being developed, and hence we were able to have higher cognitive functions, which is a good thing. And so because of that, we had this access to all these different types of food. We made progress in terms of society, being more technological, developing tools, hunting for a variety of food. And so what was available to us in terms of higher fat, higher protein, all, again, feed back into our evolution. And as that evolved, we had access to a wide spectrum of micronutrients, both macro and micronutrients. And because of that, we start to lose the ability to synthesize some of those nutrients. So I don't know if you're aware, but human beings, along with some primates, the cute little gerbil, are the only species that cannot produce vitamin C. Did everybody know that? No, I see something like that's actually true. We cannot produce vitamin C. Hence, that's why if we don't get sufficient vitamin C, we get scurvy. We get sick. We get very sick. You can die from scurvy, really. And the theory behind that is because we had access to food that were high in vitamin C. Evolution, nature, and its wisdom going, well, why are you working to produce something that you have easy access to? Because that takes energy. So shut that gene down, get your vitamin C from your food, and you're good. Well, that's going to have consequence down the road, right? When we have these long voyages where millions of sailors actually die from scurvy because they were not able to have access to vitamin C. So that's sort of the evolution, a picture, I guess, of how we are changing and how nature is changing us. So speed up another 10,000 years, we settle down, we start to farm, and you can kind of appreciate how our diets have changed. Now we have less, we're not chasing wild animals around, so our protein or fat intake goes down. We are doing a lot more farming, growing a lot more crops, so our carb intake goes up. And the nutrients associated with that type of diet also changes as well, right? And so that has, I'm not going to go through the kind of epi-evidence of the diseases that start to come up as our food source change. And then we speed up even more to the Industrial Revolution of, I guess, the most drastic change in a very compressed period of time in human history to the foods that we have now. I mean, I have to say what we eat now is very different from what I had access to as a child. So that's how much that has changed and has speeded up. And so in terms of the nutrient content, we've almost kind of done a flip to what we were used to what we had access to what we eat now. But our biology doesn't change that fast, right? I mean, there's spontaneous mutations within certain diseases. But overall, the physiology we have now, the gut we have now, the brain we have now, it's very much like what our ancestors had 20, 25, 100,000 years ago. That in itself hasn't changed. But what we are putting into the body now is very different from that. So you can kind of appreciate the incompatibility in that situation. And so that is going to affect how we feel, how we think, how we are as people. So looking at our diet from a modern society perspective, we, and I'm sure all of you kind of aware of all of this, these massive farms, these producing foods that is needed by our growing population. So it's a matter of producing volume, like quantity, and not so much quality. And so there is evidence that the nutrients that are in our food that are grown now has definitely decreased compared to 50 years, 100 years ago. And that's very, very recent in terms of time. So our agricultural practices have definitely changed, and it needed to, right, to support our population. And then in terms of the science of food, in a way we seem to know more, and yet not so much in terms of our understanding of how nutrients affects our bodies and our brain. Do you know that how we figure out the role of nutrients is mainly due to the fact that those nutrients were actually stripped out of food, and then symptoms of deficiency showed up. And so that's how we figure out, oh, this pellagra is due to niacin deficiency, or scurvy is due to vitamin C deficiency because it was no longer in our food supply, and then we start developing symptoms and going, oh, okay, there's something important in the foods that our body actually needs. And so that's kind of the evolution of the science behind food, which I find fascinating. And nowadays, a lot of us get our information from marketing strategies from food producers. This whole concept of consumer, providing what the consumer demands, what the consumer wants. And for the most part, the consumer wants, what do we normally want?
French fries?
Mm-hmm. Things that are tasty, right? Things that are fast, definitely. So high fat, high sugar, things that will make us continue to eat more, right? That's, again, part of the strategy.
Everything instant. Instant noodles.
Because you have an app and then you can order that because it's so instant. So what does the modern food production look like? Who here enjoys a good burger? One person? Really? No. Everybody else is lying. No? Okay. Well, a burger is a very popular food in North America. And when you think about a burger, you think, well, it's pretty straightforward, pretty simple, right? You get your bun, your lettuce and tomato, the meat, maybe some cheese, some condiment, about a half a dozen items, right? That sounds about right. Well, whether you get that burger, and I'm not quite sure if everybody's being truthful when they say they don't eat burgers. Whether you get that burger at the Cake, at McDonald's, or at Costco, chances are it takes this many ingredients to make your burger. This is the reality of our food supply. So I actually just want to read a quote from that paper. It does come from a paper. Today's food systems are diverse and complex, involving everything from subsistence farming to multinational food companies. The cheeseburger includes more than 50 ingredients, which is mind-blowing to me, sourced from pretty much every country and continent except probably, well, yes, not probably, but Antarctica and the Arctic, right? And the food processing supplies include processing equipment, packaging, chemicals such as disinfectants and preservatives. And agriculture inputs can go from feed to fertilizer to vaccines and pharmaceuticals, from planting to harvesting equipment. So that takes a lot of resources to produce that burger. And the thing that caught my eye was all these, I don't have a pointer, but some of the terms that are up here. Sorbitol, polysorbate, sodium steroid, lactylate. I spent a lot of time studying food, and I don't know what those terms are. Yeah, so a lot of chemicals that we're not familiar with, not just at a language level, but our bodies do not recognize. So think of the evolutionary need. Like in maybe 20,000 years, we can digest that. But at this point in time, I think it would be very challenging to say, yes, that is what our bodies need. Right. Yeah, I'm killing your lunch right now, aren't I? And dinner. That's why I don't get invited back for talks, because people don't like me to talk. Yeah, so that, and those are just a list of the countries where the ingredients would be sourced. Right. Sorry about that. You'll look at your plate differently. But it might, inspire you to change a little bit on, or at least just pay attention and notice what's on the plate. So now I think you can appreciate the characteristics of what we eat is very different from how we are programmed to eat, biologically, physiologically. So looking at this diagram, in terms of macronutrient composition, I think you can kind of see the shift that has changed, right? From what we've been used to eating 20, 50, 100,000 years ago to what we have now. And so there's definitely a drastic decrease in the fiber content. And these are just some of the nutrients, not even going to all the different nutrients. That has drastically changed. Our sodium-potassium balance has shifted so much, where it's, we have a very high sodium content diet, and most of us do not get enough potassium, and that has an impact on our acid-base balance in our body. And so a lot of the foods we consume hike up the acidity within our blood. And decrease the base from the foods that we put in. And then at the micronutrient level, again, definitely not as dense in terms of micronutrients. Fat composition has changed. Our intake of omega-3s, which is one of the essential fatty acids, is much lower than what our bodies need and than what we're used to. And our glycemic load, again, has shifted to where we are having to process more and more carbs, especially refined carbs. And so more and more evidence is accumulating. This is just, very short examples. You can go on pages and pages of the research that are done linking diet to mental health. Several studies have looked at the intake of omega-3. Fatty acids, fish, populations that have high fish intake, and the prevalence of psychiatric disorders, mental disorders, and it's an inverse relationship. Okay, and these are based on epidemiological data, so we're talking about relationships and associations, of course. Within the Canadian data, from the CCHS survey, there's one study found an association between higher fruit and vegetable intake and lower odds of depression. Okay. And what's more interesting to me is that less than 50% of the population consume enough of the recommended daily intake of fruits and vegetables. So 47% for women, and then men, for some strange reason, do not like fruits and vegetables. Yeah. Only about a third of them consume the recommended daily serving, right? And that's pretty low. And in Alberta, 37% reported that they take in the recommended serving of minimum 5 a day, and that is lower than the Canadian average. So, and it may have to do with access. We don't know. And it's somewhat recent data. It's 2012. So it's not like it was 20 years ago. And more when we look at overall dietary patterns, there is a trend. Those of us who consume more of a more Western diet, what we in the in the field call the standard American diet, SAD. Again, there's a higher correlation to mental disorders such as depression and anxiety. And so there's definitely an association between quality and disease. And we know because so much of the food is missing these important vital nutrients, the nutrients are cofactors in so many enzymatic metabolic pathways. And so if those cofactors, those basic building blocks are not there, the body's not going to be able to function properly. So what is the link? What are the theories behind that? And there are theories as to how this may be the case. We know that we are not the same from a genetic perspective in terms of that there are individual biochemical differences, what we call biochemical individuality, right? My requirement for fats is going to be very different from yours or yours or yours. My requirement for vitamin C, for magnesium, any other nutrient is likely to be different. And there's different components to that. So there are inherent polymorphisms within our genetic makeup where one group may have a higher demand for one nutrient than another, okay? And so we're not, from a nutrient perspective, we're not necessarily are all the same. Some of us have slower metabolic functions than others. I know I do, because I remember when I was in my 20s and had my wisdom tooth pulled out and had to undergo a general anesthetic. I could not stand up for 2 days because it took so long for that drug to get on my system, because I'm a slow metabolizer. So I know that about myself. And so I know I need certain nutrients more so than others, and my ability to process them is different from other people. And we know that looking at certain genetic diseases, there are nutrient requirements that will help to reduce the symptoms of those diseases. And what are the mechanisms in terms of the food, the chemicals that we put into our body, and how that may contribute to dysfunction, I guess, in the various systems? There are a number that are being studied at this moment. When we talk about food and diet, one of the wiser philosophers, I think it's supposed to be Aristotle, but he gets credits for way too many things. But he's supposed to have said that let food be our medicine and medicine be thy food, right? It can be our medicine. It could be also or poison. The poison depends on the dose, and nowadays the poison depends on what we put into our body. And so the poison can lead to metabolic dysregulation because we're not able to process it. It can lead to chronic inflammatory reactions, and we know that has happened, and that's related to a number of chronic diseases. Increase in oxidative stress because the body needs to detoxify, needs to neutralize a lot of those chemicals that we do not recognize, that we did not evolve with. Change to our gut biome, and that is a term that is coming up more and more, the health of our gut, the microbiome, the microbiota, the bacteria that we've been treated as invaders is actually good for us and necessary for survival. We're now recognizing, which all may contribute to how well our mitochondria functions, because that's the low fuel house that produces our energy. And so this is just to give you an example of the recognition of the importance of the nutrition on the brain. It says that it's been long suspected that relative abundance of specific nutrients can affect cognitive processes and emotions. Newly described influences of dietary factors on neuronal functions and synaptic plasticity has revealed some of the vital mechanisms that are responsible for brain health through our diet. And so this was in Nature just a little while ago. So, back to you again, quiz time after all that. Which food contains an essential nutrients that guards against dementia? How many say A? 2, 3, 4. B? No? C? Oh, okay, majority says C. Interesting. The answer is A. The wrongly aligned egg yolk, which we've been told not to eat because it's high in cholesterol, which is no longer true. I mean, it does contain cholesterol, but it's not necessarily bad for us. And I can do another talk on cholesterol myself. So egg yolk contains a vital nutrient called choline. Choline is an essential nutrient that has been shown to, it's important in brain development. So in studies with rats that were fed a diet with choline had better performances at a later age and showed to have their equivalence of not having dementia compared to rats that were not fed the same diet, that were low in choline. Okay. So there's a lot of research interest in choline. Which spicy food, or which spice actually, contains a substance that prevents Alzheimer's disease? And this is in rats, by the way. Who says curry or A? 2, 3, 4. Okay, about half a dozen. Jalapeno? 1, 2. I'm a fan of jalapeno. Wasabi. You wrote it twice. No? Okay, wasabi. Somebody voted twice, I'm pretty sure. So 2 people? 3 wasabi? Okay. The answer is A, curry. Curry contains turmeric. Curry is just a bunch of spices put together. And so within that is a spice called turmeric. That's the orange coloring you see in when you go and have Indian food. And within turmeric is a substance, a compound called curcumin. Curcumin has been shown, again, these are lab studies. I don't know how it's going to get into human studies. But curcumin has a substance that's shown to block the buildup of beta amyloid, which is a substance that builds up in people with Alzheimer's disease. So there's something interesting going on there. Oh, how about this one? I like this question. Which of the drinks have the most antioxidants? Who says green tea? A. Okay. B, red wine. Oh, that's pretty close. I know. That's almost a tie there. Is it C?
Yeah.
Okay, 1 person, 2 people says C. The answer is C.
Yeah.
Our chocolate has more antioxidants than the other 2. I know. The other. Well, yes. So it has to be the dark, real chocolate, not your Nescafe, milky, pseudo, whatever. So quality does matter in this case, which is good news for me because I cannot take the caffeine in green tea. And I'm missing an enzyme to break down red wine. I'm like a genetic wreck. So hot chocolate, it's good for me in this case. So drink more hot chocolate. Okay, I've talked more than I wanted to. So I'll just talk somewhat briefly about the research projects that I am currently doing. These are just some of them because, again, we've been here for way too long. So mainly a cohort study and then looking at the Canadian Health Measures Survey and then a clinical trial that I've been trying to get up and running. So the APRIN study is a longitudinal pregnant cohort study that I've been involved with since its inception, almost 10 years ago. I think it's like 8 or 9 years now. And it actually came out of the work I was doing as I was working on my PhD. If anybody's looking for ideas for PhD, this is not the way to do it. Come talk to me and I'll tell you all of it. There's better ways to collect data. Anyways, the cohort, the study, came about because of two main health concerns, which I've already talked about, mental health and then neurodevelopment in children. I will not go through the stats again. These were the stats we used at the time in terms of as to behind why this cohort was important. We, at the time, when the study got the grant for the study, we had $5 million to create this cohort. So we had really strong rationale reasoning as to why it was needed. The fact that the prevalence and growing concern, growing incidence of mental health conditions, in particular depression, and then talking about depressions in moms, anxiety and depression during pregnancy, and the obstetric complications, and then developmental consequences as well for the children. And then the other aspect, looking at the rise of neurodevelopmental disorder in the children. In the States, the Pediatric Society estimates that up to 20% of school-aged children is affected one way or another with a diagnosable developmental disorder. That does not bode well for our taxpayers in the next generation. No. And we know that there are numerous nutrients that are vital to proper brain development and mental health. And I've spoken about some of them already, so I won't go into detail about them. But yes, there's quite a lot. What's interesting is that, when we think about malnutrition, we think about deficiency, insufficiency, we think, well, that happens even in North America. That happens to a certain group of people, right? Those who don't eat well, those who are of lower socioeconomic background, those who don't have access. We know food security is a problem, a challenge for a good selection of the population. What's interesting is this is actually a paper that I wrote and published in 2009, and it's one of the more highly cited papers in the journal. They sent me these news flashes about, oh, you've been cited again. But what we found through this review, a systematic review, is that it doesn't matter your economic background, your education, across the board, pregnant women were deficient in a number of nutrients, which is very concerning, right? So it's not even what you can afford, it's what's going on. And again, back to that changing structure. So the objectives were to look at what pregnant women eat in their dietary intake. And we did a very extensive data collection on that. We looked at their mental health status, in particular looking at depression and anxiety. And then we collected data on the birth experience at delivery, any obstetric outcomes. And we also looked at the development of the offspring as well. And we also collected a whole bunch of biosamples. And you can see it was a very extensive data collection we recruited women while they were pregnant in the first, second trimester, followed them all the way through, collected data after birth, after delivery, and then we collected data from the offspring as well. Right now, we're actually up to year 8 of data collection, so that this figure is a little outdated. And these are some of the huge amount of measure we use to collect the data in the periods that we collect them. In terms of the stats, for the cohort, it was an older population in terms of our moms. They were mean age was 30 for moms and 33, almost 34 for dads. And you can see that it was a very affluent group because the majority of our participants came from Calgary. And this was 10 years ago when Calgary was doing really well because oil was at like $100, $120 a barrel. Not so much now. And so majority, 55%, made over $100,000 as a household income. So very interesting. But what's more interesting is what our findings were in terms of mental health. And there were some interesting findings. The clock's running all the time. So I want to share this one with you. This is, I just actually did this slide this morning. So this is as off the presses as possible. This is a paper that I'm working on right now. We looked at nutrient biomarkers through the blood samples. And this is just some of the nutrients that is being presented here. So what you see here, looking at, it's not a continuous variable. It's kind of misleading that way. What we did was actually just connect the points of the 3 time points of data collection. 1 is first trimester, 2 is second trimester, 3 is third trimester, and 4 is 12 weeks postpartum. And so what you see is the values for the blood nutrients. And what we did was we used the Edinburgh Postpartum Depression Scale. And it's a very commonly used screening tool that AHS actually uses in their home visits with new moms. And we categorized it into tertiles. So short of the story is that women who score lower on the scale are less likely to be depressed. Those who score high are much more likely to be depressed. And so the red line are those who have a score of 18 to 24. And the black line are those with a score of 0 to 6. And for omega-3s, you can see a clear difference between the two groups, much lower in moms who score in the high tertile. And then the bottom here, what I find interesting is that hematocrit is lower in the depressed moms than the non-depressed moms. And same with ferritin, which is iron. Right. So hematocrit is the ratio of red blood cells to volume, to the total volume of blood. So if we don't have sufficient iron to make red blood cells, the hematocrit is going to be lower. So I personally found that really interesting. And so there's definitely a relationship going on, something going on. And keep in mind, this is an affluent population. To have this show up kind of, again, tells a really interesting story. So there's a couple of sub-studies I'm doing that I've gotten additional funding for. One is looking at the nutrients status using blood samples in moms with gestational diabetes and perinatal depression. I just want to see if there's a link between those two conditions. And the other sub-study that I'm doing right now with some people, Dr. Galinda Metz over at Neuroscience, is using urine to develop a metabolomics profile, looking at how moms may differ in terms of their metabolic function if they have a metabolic condition like diabetes or obesity compared to those who don't. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over these. And this one is a clinical trial that I am working on. It's a multi-site, straightforward, I guess, RCT, double-blind, placebo-controlled. It's going to be 3 sites, 1 site based out of Lethbridge and then 2 sites in the States. And we're looking to use a multi-micronutrient to treat kids aged 6 to 12 with ADHD. The rationale behind it, you're interested, let me know, I'll email it to you. Our aims, the data we're looking to collect, and summing up. So hopefully you'll now have a deeper appreciation of the connection between food, nutrition, and the brain, and the sources of where that data is coming from. And if anybody is open to opportunities for collaboration or partnership in doing more of this work. And that's it. Whew.